in the early 70s. So there was these growing tensions with the students in the late 60s and early 70s. And so the Mobutu very much considered that the students had to be controlled and repressed. And part of the measures he took was, yes, using violence, forced cooptation. But there was this radical transformation of higher education in the early 70s that ultimately destroyed Congolese universities. I mean, there are many universities in Congo facing extreme challenges that can be dated somehow to the consequences of Mobutu's policies in the 70s. And I think it's interesting to see maybe something similar happening in the US, I guess, where there is form of an ideological struggle on the parts of the Trump administration and Republicans, where they don't see the destruction of universities and higher education as a problematic collateral of that or part of the plan.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. Today, we're really happy to be speaking to Pedro Monaville. He's a historian of modern Africa and an associate professor at McGill University. His research focuses on colonial and post-colonial Congo, revolutionary movements, popular culture, memory work, and the connections between visual arts and history. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Pedro.
Thank you.
Hi, Pedro. Welcome. If I may be ridiculous and try to sum up a few hundred years of the history of the enormous Central African country of Congo, let me try. What is now the Democratic Republic of Congo's history is marked by centuries of exploitation and political upheaval. The Congo was colonized in two phases. First, King Leopold II of Belgium established the Congo Free State as his personal possession in 1885. His rule was brutal and focused only on extracting wealth. One of the most famous types of abuse was the amputation of hands and feet of Congolese individuals, including men, women, and their children, if they failed to meet quotas for rubber or ivory collection. After years of international pressure and public outcry of the widespread atrocities, the Belgian state annexed the country and ran it as a colony until 1960, when the country gained independence under Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. But Lumumba's vision of true sovereignty was cut short by his assassination months later in a plot that may have been planned by the CIA because of Lumumba's leftist tendencies. The subsequent Congo crisis led to decades of authoritarian rule under Mobutu Sese Seko, whose rule ended in 1997. His kleptocratic regime systematically dismantled institutions and suppressed the intellectual class. Is that about right, Pedro? And if it is, what can you tell us about Mobutu? Where did he come from and how did he rise to power?
Yeah, I think that you did a good job at summarizing this history there. Quite dramatic, tragic history. Where did Mobutu come from? Mobutu was, by the time of the Congo's independence in 1960, was a young man. He was a member of Patrice Lumumba's political party, the MNC, the Congolese National Movement. He had a few years in the colonial military. He had been drafted, as many Congolese in the 1950s, not by choice, but by force. He had a little bit of training as a journalist. And as a journalist, he stayed in Belgium for a few months at the very end of the 1950s, when very few Congolese actually had access to the metropole at the time. In the days after Congo's independence, there was a series of dramatic events that happened, the so-called Congo crisis. And one of them was this mutiny of the army just a few days after independence, the soldiers' mutiny, which created a rather chaotic situation. And in this context, Lumumba chose Mobutu as the new head of the military. So he was chosen by Lumumba, but he turned against his mentor and friend. He turned against Lumumba in September 1960, so just barely 2 months after independence. He turned against Lumumba and he became part of the group of Congolese who worked closely with foreign intelligence services. So you mentioned the CIA. Belgian secret services were also very much involved in trying to get rid of Lumumba during that time. There are also the role of UN diplomats, officials also in Leopoldville, Kinshasa. And so Mobutu was around that and he turned against Lumumba and he remained as the head of the Congolese military. And he finally took power in 1965 with a military coup. And he stayed in power for 32 years.
Can you talk a little bit about how Mobutu dismantled and corrupted state institutions? Was there any ideology behind it, or was it simply a lust for power?
Yes, someone who stayed in power for 32 years. There is some complexities, and there is a great degree also of skills and shrewdness. Certainly, Mobutu I think he was certainly interested in projecting a certain image of himself and of his regime politically. So to come back to that moment in 1960 of the Congo crisis, so he in many ways played a major role in the circumstances that led to Lumumba's assassination. So arresting Lumumba, keeping him under house arrests. Then, Lumumba escaped in November 1960, after several weeks under house arrest in Kinshasa. He escaped, and Lumumba tried to regroup with some of his supporters in what is today Kisangani, in the interior of Congo. And Mobutu sent his troops to arrest Lumumba with the help of the US Embassy in Kinshasa, that loaned a helicopter that was used to capture Lumumba. And then Lumumba was put in a military camp, imprisoned. This was all under Mobutu's orders and actions. And then when Lumumba was also sent to Katanga, a province that was under secession, also Mobutu played a role. And so all of that, these were key events, that led to Lumumba's assassination in Katanga in January 1961. But at the same time, Mobutu tried to project an image of himself as a Lumumbist as well. The idea of Lumumbism is a really important political reference in Congo. It's a certain idea of decolonization, of what independence should actually mean, of real independence, so also a form of economic independence, not just political independence. And so after Mobutu took power in 1965, when he became the president after the military coup, yes, there was the attempt at, in a way, going back to certain ideals of Lumumba after a period of 5 years marked by secessions, marked by also very corrupted figures in power from 60 to 65.
Not just Mobutu, you mean everybody?
Yeah, so after Lumumba was overthrown, there were a series of figures in power, a couple of prime ministers. There were a few who had been close to Lumumba, but most of them were opponents of Lumumba. And yes, the political scene was quite corrupt, also corrupted by American money, also during these years. And so Mobutu was kind of the military guy at the time. So civilians were in power. It was obviously part of the power structures, but not very much at the forefront. And so yes, these politicians who ruled over Congo until 1965, yes, some of them were clearly highly corrupted figures. So Mobutu, when he arrived, the idea was to get rid of that, to get rid of those politicians who'd been corrupted, inefficient. The idea was to also clearly fight for the unity of Congo, which had been very important for Lumumba in the context of secession. So there was all of that. There were also measures that Mobutu took in the first few years of his regime, some measures of economic nationalizations, particularly in relation to the copper industry, which was the most important sector of Congolese industry in the 60s, in the period of independence. So there was that, and there were symbolic measures as well. What he first called authentic nationalism, and then what became later known as the return to authenticity. At first, authentic nationalism was very much about these, reforms of Congolese economy that were supposed to actually make the Congolese economy more truly independent, or more independent from outside powers and corporations. And then there was this return to authenticity that was more about a form of mental decolonization, which was also, a term that was around at the time, a form of cultural decolonization. So that started with renaming, Congolese cities' names. So Leopoldville became Kinshasa, Elizabethville became Lubumbashi, etc. And then there were many other measures part of that, changing people's name, so banning Christian names, banning forms of dress, Western dress, so for forms of more authentic dresses, etc. This was criticized at the time by Mobutu's opponents as a sort of veil, just as measures meant to mask the reality of the regime. And clearly, Mobutu was very shrewd, and so it was probably some of that. But it was also, in a way, in coherence with his own origins, political origins, or background, as someone who was started as a young nationalist close to Lumumba in the late 50s. And it resulted in actual meaningful transformations of Congolese society and culture in those years. That was sort of how I guess Mobutu established, some of his credentials and legitimacy. And it was really important for him to have a form of basic legitimacy in Congo and also outside. So these policies also were very much also a way to exist in Africa and more globally. There was the contrast here with Moïse Tshombe. It's, a really important figure that we could talk about very briefly. But Tshombe was the leader of the secession in Katanga. And so Katanga was the center of economic activities.
It's where all the copper mines were.
Copper mines. I mean, before that, uranium. The Congolese economy fully depended on these mines in Katanga.
Does Congo actually make sense as a country? I mean, it's so big, so many different language groups. How much of it is just there because King Leopold managed to grab it and then, like most African countries, we're stuck with these colonial borders? Or is there actually some kind of geographic or demographic sense to it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a good question that can be, answered with a simple yes or no, if it makes sense. I mean, in a way, it does make a lot of sense now. Did it make sense in 1885? I think this is maybe a different question. It did make some sense. There's the Congo River Basin, which is a major fact, I guess, in the Congolese space. So this huge river with all of these tributaries that, is at the center of this space. And that has been also really significant in the history of this space over thousands of years as well. So the Congo River and broader basin as multiple type of ecological environments, but the river as a kind of highway, as enabling forms of circulation in the region. And so, yes, this is a huge country, this is a huge space at the center of Africa with people who've, spoke many different languages, had different histories. But yes, there is some ways in which this, I think, was, at the sort of like physical geography, it made sense to have a political project around this space. And there, yes, there were, exchanges in that area, in the region for thousands of years, despite, significant cultural differences among the different people making the Congo today. But yes, at the same time, still, yes, there are a lot of Congolese artists and writers today, talk about the Congo as a fiction, the Congo as maybe, Leopold's fiction, or as a country that was imposed upon people who maybe didn't actually connect to it. But the same people, I think, also feel strongly attached to the idea of the Congo as a nation state today, and this history of suffering, of victimization, starting with Leopold, but even before. I mean, the 19th century was a very troubled time for the region in terms of all kinds of predation around ivory and slavery. Yeah, there is the sense of having suffered together and also having fought together as well. I was talking a lot about Lumumba before, but I think the struggle for Congo's independence and the struggle for Congo's unity as well in the aftermath of independence, this has been really important.
Pedro, just to go back to the Mobutu, the more recent era, you talked about the authenticity campaign and his effort to unite the country and to kind of create this national sense of belonging. But was he himself a charismatic leader? Did he establish a personality cult? Or was it more about these ideas that he was spreading? Like, what about himself as an individual, as a leader? Can you describe him a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, I think he can clearly be described as a charismatic leader. Through this charisma and through these policies. So there was the kleptocratic, tendencies that became out of control with time, that were maybe not so clearly dominating in the first few years of the regime, but that after 1975 and for the remainders of the regime became like clearly very, very visible, conspicuous. The kleptocratic tendencies, indeed like a form of predation and destruction of institutions and state capabilities. But before that, there was the policies of this attempt at crafting a form of ideology around African and Congolese nationalism. That was also a key moment in reinforcing this sense of common belonging for the Congolese, I think. Today there is, forms of nostalgia for Mobutu on the part of people who were not born, by the time of he was thrown out of power in 97. There is this, hip hop bands, kind of like having video clips where it's total nostalgia for the Mobutu years, because there is the idea of that at some point, Congo was strong under Mobutu or for some time and respected and could, implement the integrity of its territory, which is not the case anymore today. There is part of that with the Mobutu regime and a certain idea of Mobutu as, yes, this kind of powerful, strong. There is also very much gender considerations here, as this kind of powerful man and charismatic, yes. So who was a really good public speaker who talked to people in Lingala and in various local languages, but mostly in Lingala. That's also the language of Congolese music.
And Lingala is sort of the most sort of unifying language of the Congo. Is that right? It's the one spoken by most people, even if not as a native language. Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, once again, this actually something that Mobutu affected or inflected. Lingala was a language that it comes from a language that was spoken by people living along a big stretch of the Congo River between what is today Kisangani, a bend in the river. That's Naples' novel about Congo that's happening in Kisangani. So at the center of Congo and basically what is today Kinshasa. So over the long stretch of the Congo River, you had populations that were traveling back and forth, involved in trade, and that's the language spread. So it's a bit of the language of the river. It's a language that was transformed by the colonizers as many other languages, that was simplified, codified by the colonizers, by missionaries as well. And that emerged as one of the major languages under the Belgian colonial regime. And it was at the time mostly the language of the colonial military. It was called the Force Publique, was the colonial military. The language of the colonial military at some point became Lingala. And because the colonial military was present across the Congo, it became a language with a presence across the country. But that was not necessarily spoken by people around the country. And then it became the language of Congolese music, a genre of Congolese music known as rumba that became very big in the 1940s and that's still big in many ways today in Congo and globally, even though it has evolved quite a lot, but inspired also by rhythm coming back from Cuba and the Caribbean. But the musicians, the singers of Congolese rumba use Lingala. So that's a language that with radio kind of circulated around the country. And because of that, people understand it. It's what they listen to, even if you're in the east of Congo where Kiswahili would be the most important language, Lingala has a resonance there. But Mobutu very much also capitalized on Lingala. And so the Mobutu regime was one of the elements that also increased the circulation of this language. But it remains the language of part of the west of Congo, of Kinshasa, but one that has, yes, a little bit more circulation than other national languages. There are 4 national languages. There are hundreds of languages that people speak, but there are 4 recognized national languages. And Lingala would be the most
widespread. Can we move on to talk about the student movement? When did it start and what were its aims?
Yeah, so the student movement had a late start because there were no students for a long time in Congo.
Because there were no schools.
There were no schools, well, no universities.
No universities.
Really speaking about university student movements in my work. And the Belgians were really very afraid of the idea of Congolese with university degrees. And so they resisted the idea of Congolese higher education until quite late in the 1950s. And then there was this change on the part of the colonial apparatus. There was this idea that maybe in the end, it could be a good thing, that maybe training Congolese for advanced positions instead of creating people who would contest the colonial regime, maybe that could be a way actually to build a class of trained Congolese that could support collaboration with the Belgians. That shift happened at a time when there was also the beginning of the anti-colonial movement, when you had people were called évolués, which was a very problematic term used by the colonizers to talk about Congolese with some degree of education, but primary education, some secondary education, who had occupied positions as white collar jobs. And these people had been often trained by missionaries. And in the 1950s, even if political parties were still banned, some Evolué began to ask for autonomy and then independence to kind of counter the emergence of a burgeoning political class asking for independence. Some people in the colonial regime who thought that maybe training Congolese students could be a way to train maybe a more conservative elite that could resist claim for independence. So that happened. The first university opened its door in 1955, and then Belgians authorized Congolese to travel to Europe, to Belgium, and some other countries also to study in universities there. So that was quite late compared to other colonial territories in Africa. And the student movement initially, I mean, there was no student movement basically initially in the first few years. I mean, the students behaved more or less as Belgians expected them to behave. So as maybe more conservative, as a more conservative force or bloc. At the same time, they supported the demand for independence when it kind of increased by 1958. They were nationalists, but most students were critical towards the politicians like Lumumba that they viewed as too radical, populist, extremist. They were actually critical with the idea of democracy. They didn't think that people should vote. They had this sort of very technocratic mindset. And so after Lumumba took power, when he was over, there was a coup in September 1960 against Lumumba, in which Mobutu played a role. There was a different government that was put in place to replace Lumumba's government. And most ministers in that government were students. Some people would just finish their university education, but also others were still students, had not yet gotten the degree and who created the government at the same time they were finishing their education. So it was a little bit of a specific situation, but that's quite emblematic of a broader political views among the students at the time. And that the beginning of a moment of rupture and the beginning of the student movement, the element that very much led to that was the assassination of Lumumba in January 1961. So that kind of created a shock. And so, which was really striking for me in my research, speaking to former student activists. But they were really people who were quite conservative until that time, and who woke up, nearly from one day to the other. There was a moment of realization when Lumumba was assassinated about the stakes of the time, about what was happening, in Congo and the world, and so there was this shift among many students who had been maybe not involved in politics and Lumumba's assassination kind of changed very much that. And the students who arrived after that arrived also with a very different mindset. And so the beginning of the student movement can be dated from 1961. There was the creation of an important student organization at the time. And the student movement became very much a force trying to stay true to Lumumba's ideals that were about the unity of Congo in the context of secessions, about Pan-Africanism as well, and also about a certain vision of, economic independence. So that was sort of the foundation of the student movement at the beginning. And from there, through the 1960s, there was this movement towards the left, and with important groups and factions of students moving towards forms of what we could call revolutionary politics, with projects of radical transformations.
Pedro, just to interrupt you a little bit, because we were on this theme of radical politics in your book, you write about this movement as being directly connected to big questions of the world. I guess that's kind of linked to this big leftist ideas. And I was especially struck by the quote that read something like, being a student is being a man in the world. It's this really big, grandiose idea. And I was curious if you could explain to us a little bit what this means exactly, being a man of the world as a student, and how unique was the student movement in comparison to other movements in the world in the 60s. And I was especially thinking of Ethiopia, a country that I've studied for my research and also read a lot about when it comes to student movements. If you can comment a little bit about the contrast, but also this idea of being somehow cosmopolitan or a man in the world. And of course, we can talk about gender further on as well. That was also very striking in this quote.
Yeah. No, it's an important phrase because it encapsulates some of the tensions and contradictions of student politics in the 1960s, but also very much the the specificity and I think that the strong identity of student politics, a man of the world. I guess that could probably apply to other student movements in Africa in those years, and probably Ethiopia as well, where indeed, the student movement in Ethiopia was a very important force, like leading to the revolution of 1974. And there's some interesting parallels, and there are other cases as well. Like Senegal was a really important place also for student activism in Africa in the 60s, or South Africa with the Black consciousness movement and Steve Biko in the late 60s, and many other places. And I think that phrase could actually apply to student identity in different parts of the continent. But I also think it has a specific resonance in Congo as well. But so I mean, it's a phrase that can be as different different meanings. But as you mentioned, Maria, there is the gender dimension. We can talk more about it. But yes, students were mostly male until quite late in the 1970s. So there was a strong gender dimension in how students conceive of themselves as men of the world, very much in this gender dimension as well. But there is also this social, it's about class as well. So a form of elitism. Because really, I mean, to be a student in Congo in the 1960s was to have access to resources that were really significant. The state scholarships the students received was very significant. They lived in relatively comfortable settings in university campuses. They were able to travel. And because there was no elite or educated elite in Congo, by just being a student, you already made it. We were going to be part of the elite building this nation, this new nation, this young nation. So there was this class dimension as well, or kind of a class aspiration. But from that, what students did, I think there was a political construct. From this sense of elitism, this became the foundation for a form of vanguardism, of political vanguardism. So the students thought that they had a specific responsibility in relation to their country, in relation also to the world. That was based on this feeling of elitism, of late colonial elitism. And one really important aspect for students was that they considered that they occupied a unique position at the interface between the Congo and the broader world, because universities were, places to learn about advanced, knowledge. They had access to books that other people didn't have access to. Yet they were able to travel, so they started to forge connections, alliances. They were interested about thinking not just about the situation of Congo, but more broadly Africa and the world. And so they thought that their role was to translate Congolese realities to outsiders, but also to import to Congo ideas about politics, about the world.
Pedro, was this elitist kind of orientation of the student movement also a limitation of sorts? Like I'm thinking about movements, for instance, in contemporary Russia, where there are a lot of also elitist groups of society that participated in movements against Putin, a lot of students, but also intellectuals, and it didn't really kind of connect with a range of other concerns from broader society that actually supported him. So the movement died out as a result of it being kind of marginalized and elitist. I'm curious, was that also weakness, or do you think they were able to connect with other strands and engage other members of society, including women who were not part of this education class at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that was both a strength and a weakness. It was a strength in the sense that it allowed for this very strong feeling of belonging, of identity. Being a student was a powerful marker. And because of that, it was because of this strong identity that the movement was able to also emerge powerfully. And in defense of this identity sometimes, but also building on that for other purpose. But it was also a limitation. It was a limitation that many students were very much aware of. So there was this, soul searching and self-criticism on the part of the movement as well. But there was a limitation. And when you want to speak about, you want to speak for others, but you feel different from these others, that was quite a limitation. At the same time, so many students didn't come from privileged backgrounds. So there was this kind of class status that was more an aspiration than a fact. They were coming from, many of them were coming from rural background, not necessarily very privileged, or parents who had been, working in the mining sector as industrial workers. etc. So there were these connections that were still happened through, and it was the families where they came from, etc. But yes, there was a sense among many students that an important limitation was connected to this elitism. And, in many ways, the trajectory of the student movement towards the left was often came from attempts to go beyond these limitations. And so in a way, there was also the idea of like, I guess, class suicide. I mean, maybe not framed in those terms, but that's, the students themselves, I think, were the problem. So students see the idea of elitism as a problem. So like how to go beyond that. And many of the people that I studied in my work were the students who also dropped out of, university, who decided that at some point, to join armed rebellions that became professional revolutionaries of sort. And that was often because they were thinking about the limitations of this kind of elitist structure.
Very interesting. Shifting towards the reaction of the regime towards the student movement, in the book you describe the horrendous violence that the regime and its military deployed against the students. You describe a gruesome scene in response to the student march on June 4th, 1969. After murdering many students, quote, Pius Subway, the general inspector of the police, led a team of policemen who snatched the bodies of dead students from the mortuary of Kinshasa's general hospital so they could be buried in an anonymous mass grave. I found this quote just incredibly striking and just horrifying. Can you talk more about the systematic violence of the Mobutu regime in targeting the intellectual class that you studied in this book, and what were the long-term consequences of this repression for Congolese political intellectual life? Was anyone ever held accountable for this violence in contemporary DRC or not? So just kind of bring us back to maybe a little bit forward to the present moment of how this impacted intellectual politics of today.
Yeah, that demonstration in 1969 that became a massacre. It was a really important moment, and it's really important to the legacy and memory of the Congolese student movement, because then I think, yes, this violence actually very much came to define the movement of the experience of violence. It was really important for that generation of students to this kind of traumatic moment. But it also placed the student movement in a form of chain of or genealogy of political violence in Congo, of repression, which for me was just so, striking, because, you mentioned the name of the one police officer, Pius Sapwe, was involved. So yes, kind of in the massacre and the aftermath of the massacre, getting rid of the bodies of students who had been killed during the march. But the same person had been a policeman in Katanga in 1961 when Lumumba was assassinated, and he was involved also in the disappearance of Lumumba's body, because when Lumumba was assassinated in 61, he was shot at and he was executed, and he was very quickly buried. But a few days after that, his body was destroyed and dissolved in acid by two Belgian policemen. But Pius Sapwe was kind of someone who helped this.
He's like specialized in these horrendous acts of disappearance. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have this kind of clear connection here, with this person being present in these two moments. Yeah, there is this sort of chain of violence, of repression that is also of colonial violence. That's, what is very significant also about that massacre in 1969 is that it's not significant in the way that it would be the first instance of mass violence committed by the Mobutu regime. There had been other before and through the 60s, but it was the first time, I think, that this happened in the space of the city of Kinshasa. So in the mid-60s, there was extreme levels of violence against the armed rebellions that were mostly peasant rebellions. They were called the Simba rebellions between 1964 and 1967, more or less. And Mobutu was part of that, and there were massacres of populations. And so some students' activists had been part of that, but these were mostly peasants' rebellions in the countryside. But in 1969, it was kind of in the open, so to speak. It was also against, yes, a group that was an elite group that was seen as the future of the country. So that was a form of rupture of, I think, what was acceptable in terms of how people could conceive of political violence. But that was the first massacre in Kinshasa since 1960. 1959. So the 10 years before, this was a colonial massacre during a protest when Congolese asked for independence, where the military opened fire on protesters as well that were unarmed, and more than 200 people were killed in 1959. And 10 years later, we have Mobutu kind of just bringing back forms of repression, violent forms of repression that were, I think, have this kind of colonial origin. Puts, this moment into a chain of massacres, of violence. What is also actually quite striking is that the police and the military did in 1969, so killing protesters were unarmed in the streets, taking their bodies, then making these bodies disappear. It happened again several other times during the Mobutu dictatorship. It happened again, notably in 1992, when there was a massive protest against the Mobutu regime again in 1992, with 1 million people in the streets of Kinshasa. And one of the main leaders of the March of 1992 was the student who organized the march in 1969. So there is also this kind of connections. And in 1992 as well, the army opened fire, protesters were killed, and their bodies were disappeared or destroyed. This is really important, I think, about the memory and the significance of this moment. And in terms of people being held accountable, there's not been much accountability. There's been attempts. So in the early 1990s, also around the time of this other march that I was just talking about, there was a movement for democratization in Congo. So there was the end of the Cold War. Mobutu was losing some of his foreign support. There was this push within Congo for democratization. The regime was falling apart. And so Mobutu had to accept to organize a big national sovereign conference, which is also a process that happened in many other countries in Africa.
It was regional. I was traveling quite a lot in Central and East Africa at the time, including then Zaire. And the word multipartyism was something you heard everywhere. Zambia, Tanzania, Congo. That wasn't just Congo, right? That was sort of the end of the Cold War, just opened up a whole different way of looking at many African countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And this structure of the national sovereign conferences, that's something that was a model that actually came from Togo at first, and it happened in many Francophone African countries. So the conference was supposed, was hundreds of delegates, and it was this big forum to imagine a new constitution, to imagine a transition towards democracy. And Mobutu was kind of at first saying he was open to it, even though he totally manipulated the process and he used also chaos and violence, etc. And the transition never happened. In the end, the regime failed because of Kabila arriving with an armed rebellion in 1997. But in the context of the National Sovereign Conference, there was a lot of discussion. There was also a relatively opening up of the press, with new titles emerging and people being able also to speak in the streets. It's this kind of very popular movement as well, happening among the delegates in the streets of Kinshasa. And the crimes of Mobutu, the Mobutu regime, were discussed, were debated at the conference in the streets of Kinshasa at the time. And so there were some people who testified, who talked of what happened in 1969. And so that was an important moment in bringing some clarity about the events, including, so these events, not only the student massacre of 1969, but it was discussed during the conference. So no one was ever held accountable, but there was this moment when, yes, more clarity was made. But I think, one reason why there's this issue with accountability, I think is also connected to the nature of Mobutu's regime, which used open violence, but which was also very much trying to create a form of complicity among the elite and also with students. I mean, something very, very important for Mobutu was keeping everyone on their toes, and so it was very common to be a minister, to be in government, and then from one day to the other to find oneself in jail, and then after a few months maybe you become an ambassador in Japan or somewhere else. There's the kind of cycles. Yes, people didn't really know what to expect. So you could be tortured, there were opponents or figures were tortured and then brought back as in government after that. And so in a way, at some point, I mean, there are people who remain like an opponent to the regime until the end, or who were in exile, but there were a lot of people who actually had worked with Mobutu, and that I think that was part of the strategy of how he was able to maintain himself in power for so long. Is that in a way, at some point, everybody in this kind of elite spheres had been complicit somehow, and that create conditions that are, not necessarily the best condition for, yes,
Accountability, yeah.
accountability and justice. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is very interesting, the theme of complicity that you bring up and this entwined nature of relationships between different elites and the regime itself and even people going through this very tumultuous trajectories of being imprisoned and then suddenly released and imprisoned again, and just all this kind of chaos that makes me think of our realities here in the US, where Jeremy and I are residing in the South in this country, and you're watching us from a little bit from afar, right? From Canada, but very close by. So we're experiencing a lot of these shadows of some of these realities you described here, and as well as the crackdown on the education system and intellectual class in America, and so much coercion against universities, and again, complicity by universities as well. And of course, the right-wing resurgence. So I was curious, as a professor, as a scholar, as a historian, and as an intellectual living in Montreal, how do you see these realities in America? Like the kind of, how do you view what's happening here? And do you see the current student bodies in universities you teach or visit, for talks as potentially, quote, revolutionary? How do you perceive this student body itself? I'm very curious as a fellow academic as well.
It's interesting to me to see, yes, the, kind of some parallels. So Mobutu, to come back just to Mobutu for 1 second, but in the early 70s, so there was these growing tensions with the students in the late 60s and early 70s. And so the Mobutu very much considered that the students had to be controlled and repressed. And part of the measures he took, was, yes, using violence, forced cooptation, but there was this radical transformation of higher education in the early 70s that ultimately destroyed Congolese universities. I mean, there are many universities in Congo that are facing extreme challenges that can be dated somehow to the consequences of Mobutu's policies in the 70s. And I think it's interesting to see maybe something similar happening in the US, I guess, where there is form of an ideological struggle on the parts of the Trump administration and Republicans, where they don't see the destruction of universities and higher education as a problematic collateral of that or part of the plan. That's interesting to see happening again. This fixation on higher education and students. On the part of Mobutu, there was not a fixation on scholars so much. It was really more students than faculty, but as the enemy, and that's kind of happening in a different context. Thinking about the students as revolutionaries, I mean, this is. It's not something I actually kind of I'm necessarily thinking too much, in relation to the students I teach or that, kind of what I'm seeing. But it's also not something that was, I think, kind of natural for students in Congo in the 60s. I mean, we talked about that, the fact that this kind of push towards more revolutionary politics was often happening after kind of an autocritique, a break from the mold of, there was the necessity to leave the ivory tower, to leave the bubble of university campuses for this kind of full trajectory of radicalization to happen. And to me, what I've seen, in the 2010s or in the past 15 years, I mean, there was this really interesting movement happening on campuses. And, with my students, I had many discussions about decolonization, that applies very well to the topics that I teach, and the decolonizing the curriculum and these kind of really important questions that were debated, that students took at heart. And I feel where maybe also where there was also the difficulty to transcend that, I think, to kind of how do you go from these debating these questions about knowledge, how questioning higher education to, broader questions, I think. I think maybe one of the elements of shift of the recent year for me would be the struggle around Gaza and Palestine, which I feel is maybe where we see something different, I think, where I see something different on the part of student activism on campus. And I feel that might be the foundation for new forms of student activism. I don't know if it's going to be revolutionary, but...
it's a big expectation to be revolutionary.
Yeah.
High benchmark.
Pedro, do you think that Americans living under Trump can learn anything from the Congolese people's struggles, first to rid themselves of the colonizers and then of Mobutu?
Yeah. What can they learn about the Congolese? I don't know. I mean, they're in a very different position.
Well, let's put it this way. The Congo is a huge country that was run by a dictator with grandiose ideas about himself. And that's very similar to America right now. I mean, what can we take away from, looking at Mobutu as this figure who dominated everything about his country for so long?
I mean, one good thing I think for Americans and the world is that Trump will not stay in power as long as Mobutu did. I
We
think
hope so, but don't know.
Biology might intervene,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, biology could be an interruption.
will be-
Unless he has some special.
I don't think the Supreme Court will, but
Yeah.
biology might.
Biology might be a hindrance.
you don't know about the progress of medicine, but I think biology will be a factor at some point. It'll be out because of that. And Mobutu also kind of nearly died in power in 1997. Like he lost power, but he died just a few months after from cancer. So yeah, I think hopefully Trump will not stay as long. But there is this kind of theory, correspondences in terms of contents are quite different. But I mean, Mobutu was very Marie talked about a cult of personality. There was a cult of personality around Mobutu. There was a taste for flashy, kind of Versailles-like, kind of golden palaces, etc. That I think aesthetically, I think Trump and Mobutu would have some kind of common taste. Mobutu was, one of the power of Mobutu was to remain at the center always, by shifting people around himself and these kind of spectacles. It was really interesting that Trump was, inspired by his visit to France to organize a military défilé on the day of his birthday, and Mobutu also liked these kind of things. The power of Mobutu was that you couldn't really talk about him even beyond closed door. I mean, people were really afraid, and was the idea that he was everywhere. He was everywhere. So he was able to project himself in all spaces, and it was without Twitter or social media, but just occupying all the space, which I think Trump has also been very good at, doing, was something that you find with figures like Mobutu as well, to a degree that was very, 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 very high. But I'm hoping that the collapse of institutions in the US and basic freedom will not be as bad as it became in Congo Zaire in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Gosh. Well,
Can be a rapid process of erosion.
Who knows what we'll be facing, Jeremy? We're on the brink of things. Anyways, last question. What are people in Congo saying about the so-called Congo-Rwanda peace agreement?
Yeah, the one negotiated by Trump. I mean, so the maybe it's a bit too early to see what's going to come out of that. So there's been a lot of disappointment on the part of Congolese in relation to the conflict. This is not recent. It's been ongoing for many, many years. On the part of some people in political circles, certainly in government, I think there were hopes that, they could leverage Congolese natural resources. In the past 20 years, 25 years, there's been this openness maybe before that, actually, there's been this openness on the part of the political establishment to very much, kind of strategically use Congolese resources, give access to outsiders to Congolese resources as a tool of political survival, but also maybe here, as a way to maybe solve this military conflict with Rwanda. And because the Trump administration is so transactional, there was the possibility of kind of agreements in the same way as Trump is negotiating agreements around Ukrainian natural resources. I mean, the same thing is kind of happening in Congo as well. And I think this kind of transactional approach is appealing to some in the political establishment. Let's do what we can and try to kind of reverse the balance. And especially in the context in which Congolese feel that the US has been in support of the Kagame regime for many years, the UK as well. And so there is the possibility here of maybe trying to, with a figure maybe less attached to the way things have been going on for some time, to kind of, upset the balance.
So Trump's kind of disruptive transactional diplomacy is actually appealing to some.
Yeah. To some in the political establishment. I think since the, kind of the core was signed in DC, not much has happened. And I think there's the feelings that, this might also just have been something, kind of for sure. I think the Congolese population, to speak generally, or the Congolese youth, in cities, young people would take the streets to protest. I think there is relatively little goodwill towards Western powers, including the US, even though sometimes a figure like Trump can resonate, actually. But I think there is kind of relatively little goodwill, and but it remains to be seen, if something tangible will actually come out of that agreement. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for your time and insights. And I also wanted to recommend your book to everybody. I've been reading it. It's beautifully written and extremely informative. Students of the World, Global 1968 and Decolonization in the Congo with Duke University Press. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you both.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters.
Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you.